Okay, let's practice some more when it comes to graphing a supply and demand diagram. Now, check out the other videos for how to set this up. But what's really important to understand is that we need to be in the graphical form, meaning P needs to be on one side and everything else needs to be on the other. This matches up to what we need in order to graph, where we're in that y equals b plus mx form. And that's because when we graph, actually I better scoot this over, when we graph, price is on the y-axis and Q is on the x-axis. So how do we go about graphing this? Well, let's start with this. Well, first of all, which one's supply and which one's demand? Well, because there's a negative relationship between price and quantity, this makes the top equation demand. And there's a positive relationship between price and quantity here, so this makes this supply when it comes to whatever marketplace this is. We're not going to specify. So this says that the function for demand starts at 10 and has a slope of down 1 over 4. That seems like it's pretty flat. However, when you compare it to supply, which starts at 2, again matching up, this is the B part of the y equals mx plus b, what you see is, man, the supply is down 1 over 10. So it is like super flat compared to demand. And in economics, we care about relative what these look like compared to one another. And that's because, ooh, that's a wiggly line. That's because what we care about is how things like taxes and subsidies are going to be divvied up in this type of arena. What we find is producers have a lot more options compared to consumers. So the burden of the tax that we might place on this is definitely going to go more towards the consumer side of the marketplace. And there's a video on that if you want to check that out. But I'm going to move on to this other set. So we're going to practice again. Again, the first step is to realize we need to be in that graphical form. If you need to watch the video on how to convert functions from the Q equal form to the P equal form so it gets in that y equals b plus mx form, make sure you check that out. Here's what we have. So in this case, we have a price and we have a quantity. And so this is saying, oh, this is demand because it's a negative relationship between price and quantity. This is supply because it's a positive relationship between price and quantity. Now, where does the demand function start? At 100. So we want to start at 100 for demand, and then I always like to mark off where I'm starting at 40. Notice I'm not worried about drawing to scale. What I really care about is how these interplay with each other relative to one another. And so this is saying that the demand function is down 4 over 1. Seems pretty steep compared to up 1 over 2 for supply. So we're right back to, we have demand much steeper than supply. Of course, the intersection of the two is the free market, competitive price and quantity, without any regulatory burdens like taxes. Now, I want to do the same thing. I'm going to erase this for a second, but the only thing I want to change is the relative slopes. So I'm going to make the slope for the demand function 1/2 and slope for the supply 4. So I'm just flipping them to see what happens to the marketplace. So we already understand which one's supply and which one's demand. We know that demand starts at 100, supply starts at 40. Now we have a demand function that's down 1 over 2 versus a supply function that's up 4 over 1. So pretty darn steep supply, much flatter demand. This means that consumers have a lot more options, substitutes for consumption, compared to substitutes for production. What other things I can produce with my same resources. And so if you were to impose a per unit tax in this market, you would get an opposite of what you got when consumers had fewer options. And of course, that would mean that the more of the burden of the tax would be pushed onto producers. So check out that video for what that looks like. So hopefully this gives you an idea of how to graph supply and demand under different functions.